While camping in the unforgiving forests of Alaska, my son abandoned me in the cruelest way imaginable. He left me without food, without gear, without even a flashlight, and with a cold smirk on his face he said, "Bye. Go meet the grizzly." He thought I'd die out there, either starved, frozen, or torn apart by claws. That was his plan, to let nature erase me so he could collect the inheritance he felt entitled to. But fate has a way of turning the tables. By the time he drove back home, smug and certain that he'd rid himself of me, I was already waiting there at the front door, smiling. "I have a surprise for you," I told him, calm as ever. "You won't believe what happened next." Before I could even finish, the front door crashed open. Mason stormed inside, his hoodie soaked from the Seattle drizzle, sneakers squeaking across my hardwood floors. His eyes burned with fury, his voice carried no warmth, only demand. "Dad, I need $5,000, tonight." I froze at my desk, the pen still in my hand from reviewing invoices. The sharp edge in his tone hit me like a knife. This wasn't a son asking for help. This was someone cornering me. "Mason, what?" I managed. He clenched his fists, pacing the living room like a wolf. $5,000, now. My chest tightened. I'd just transferred his allowance last week. But Mason's voice cracked with frustration, the entitlement boiling over. $3,000 barely covers rent. You think that's enough? You think that covers everything? I wiped my hands on my flannel shirt, still greasy from fixing Mrs. Chen's transmission that morning. I'd built these auto shops with sweat, with blood, with years of sacrifice after Sarah died. I gave Mason everything I never had, and yet this was what stood in front of me. A son who saw me not as a father, but as an obstacle. "Son," I said, trying to steady my voice. "We've talked about this. You need to find steady work." He spun toward me, face burning red. "Work? Why should I work when you're hoarding all this money? When you're sitting on everything like some dictator?" His words stung like salt in an open wound. I straightened, the old military posture kicking in. "I'm trying to teach you responsibility," I told him. He barked out a laugh that dripped with bitterness. "Responsibility? After you die, I'll be an amazing master of your auto shops. I'll run them better than you ever did." The words didn't just hang in the air, they poisoned it. My chest tightened. The casual cruelty. The way he spoke about my death like it was a date already circled on the calendar. I couldn't breathe. 20 years of sacrifice, of raising him alone, of hoping to build a man his mother would be proud of, all of it crumbled in that moment. Mason must have seen the horror on my face. His expression shifted. He realized he'd said too much. Without another word, he turned, yanked open the front door, and slammed it behind him. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. The family photo on the mantel rattled, Sarah's smiling face trembling behind the glass. I stood frozen, pen still gripped in my white-knuckled hand, staring at that photo as it shivered, then slowly stilled. The silence pressed down heavy on me. Outside, Mason's car engine roared to life, then faded into the night. But the words he left behind, they stayed. The truth was unavoidable now, laid out across decades of memories. Each photo I flipped through told the same hidden story. Every allowance, every bailout, every failure I'd patched up with my wallet had quietly stripped Mason of something essential. I thought I was saving him. I thought I was protecting him. Instead, I had built a stranger, a young man who could calculate my death as if it were just another business strategy. Saturday evening, I sank into Sarah's old chair, the one seat in the house I'd never had the strength to remove. Its fabric still carried the faintest trace of her perfume, or maybe it was only my mind clinging to ghosts. She would have seen this coming. Sarah always read people better than I did. She would have steered Mason toward responsibility, forced him to earn every dollar. She would never have tolerated this spiral of entitlement. I failed her, I whispered into the stillness. The confession slid from my tongue and hung in the air like frost. The weight of it seeped into my bones, cold and unforgiving. For 2 decades I had been buying Mason's love, throwing money at the void Sarah's absence left behind. Each payment was less about him and more about me, my guilt, my fear, my inadequacy. I'd convinced myself that providing was the same as parenting, when in truth, I had been raising a dependent shadow, not a man. Sunday morning, I slid the photo albums back into their place, and returned to my desk. My hands trembled as I reached for paper and pen, the old ritual of discipline calming me. Military training steadied my breathing as I began drafting contingencies I had prayed I'd never need. The blank page glared up at me, demanding decisions I wasn't ready to make. I forced the ink to flow, outlining legal arrangements, protections, strategies. Then the phone shattered the silence. 1 ring. 2 rings. My eyes flicked down to the glowing screen. Mason, I hesitated. Then I answered. Hello son, Dad. Hey, how are you doing? His tone was sugar-sweet, unnaturally bright, the kind of forced cheer that raised alarms in my gut. Too polished, too rehearsed. I'm fine, I said carefully. This is unexpected, especially after our talk last week. Yeah, about that. His words tumbled out quickly, too eager, too prepared. I was way out of line. I want to make things right. My grip on the receiver tightened. I stayed silent, letting the quiet stretch. Military habit, let the other man fill the silence. Actually, Mason continued, I have a proposal. Something that could fix everything between us. I waited, the hair on the back of my neck prickling. Let's go camping together. Just you and me. Alaska. Denali National Park, like when I was a kid, remember? The suggestion hit like whiplash. Mason hadn't wanted anything to do with hiking, fishing, or camping since high school. Now suddenly he wanted a father-son wilderness trip. This is very sudden, I said. I know, he rushed. But here's the thing. My buddies canceled last minute. I've already got the tickets. Flights, gear, permits, the whole package. It all expires tomorrow if we don't use it. My instincts screamed at me. Something was wrong. His voice was too slick, his eagerness too exaggerated. Still, I kept listening. I let him believe I was considering it, even as a cold knot twisted in my stomach. My grip tightened on the phone as Mason's pitch tumbled through the line. The urgency in his voice didn't feel natural, it felt crafted, engineered to keep me from thinking too carefully. Mason, I asked slowly, when have you ever organized a camping trip in your life? Come on, Dad, he shot back with forced warmth. Remember when you taught me to read animal tracks, how to start a fire with wet wood? You always said the wilderness shows a man's true character. The words twisted deep in my chest. He was reaching into memories I'd locked away, better days, before Sarah's death had hollowed the center of our family. Back then, I had been a father who gave presents instead of presents. I almost let myself believe him. This could be our chance to reconnect, Mason continued, his voice dropping into something softer, more sincere. Just you and me. No distractions, no city stress, just father and son out in God's country. I closed my eyes, my instincts screamed warning, the sudden interest, the timing, the too convenient excuse of canceled friends. It all reeked of orchestration, but beneath suspicion was an ache I couldn't ignore. What if it was real? What if this was the last chance my son was genuinely offering me to rebuild what had broken? The flights leave March 25th, Mason pressed, sensing hesitation. Seattle to Anchorage. Then we drive to the park, 5 days in the wilderness, like old times. 5 days, I repeated. Dad, please. These tickets are going to waste. This might be our last shot at fixing things between us. The silence stretched, my eyes drifted to the legal documents on my desk, cold insurance against futures I had prayed would never arrive. My pen hovered over them like a verdict waiting to be signed. All right, I heard myself say. Let's do it. Really, that's fantastic. I'll text you the details. Meet me at SeaTac. You'll see, Dad. This is going to be amazing. The line went dead. My hand trembled as I lowered the phone. Outside, Seattle's endless drizzle streaked the windows. I glanced back at the documents, then at the pen still in my grip. Hope and preparation. Both felt like betrayals in their own way. 3 days later, I folded the papers carefully and slid them into the inner pocket of my travel bag. They felt heavier than paper should, as if ink itself could carry dread. Mason was already waiting by gate C12, bouncing on his heels like an overeager teenager. His backpack still had the store tags dangling from the zippers. When he spotted me, his grin stretched a little too wide. Dad! Perfect timing, they just called boarding. You seem excited, I said, studying him. His left eye twitched ever so slightly, a tell I recognized from years of watching him bluff. My Navy training had taught me how to read people, to separate genuine nerves from rehearsed performance. Why wouldn't I be? Father-son adventure in the last frontier. He swung his new backpack onto his shoulder with obvious effort. Once on the first flight, Mason chattered endlessly about wilderness photography, fresh air, how he couldn't wait to disconnect. Yet every 10 minutes, he was checking his phone, scrolling, typing. For a man eager to escape the city, he was strangely tethered to it. To fill the silence, I shared old survival stories, how to read cloud patterns, spot edible plants, navigate without GPS. Mason scribbled on a napkin like an eager student. "You really know all this stuff?" he asked, wide-eyed. 20 years in the service teaches you to be prepared for anything," I replied. Something flickered in his expression, then, calculation masquerading as admiration. During our layover, Mason disappeared 3 times, each bathroom trip stretching to 20 minutes. From the terminal windows, I watched planes taxi under a steel-gray sky while suspicion gnawed at me. By the time we landed in Anchorage, crisp air and the scent of snow filled my lungs. At the rental counter, I signed paperwork for a Toyota 4Runner, chains for mountain roads, extra insurance. Mason busied himself loading gear into the trunk, favoring his right shoulder as though carrying more than just physical weight. "Next stop supplies," he announced, consulting his phone again. At Northern Exposure Outfitters, Mason insisted on specific items: heavy-duty flashlights, flares, thick ropes, far more equipment than a casual camping trip required. The clerk, an older man with weathered skin and frostbitten scars, raised an eyebrow. "Planning to get lost out there?" he asked. "Just want to be prepared," Mason answered quickly. Highway 3 unfolded before us, a ribbon of gray slicing through endless forest. Snow-capped peaks caught the last light as the sun bled toward the horizon. "Beautiful country," I said, trying to ease the tension. "Yeah," Mason replied, his tone carrying a strange edge. "Really isolated. Miles from anywhere." Later, as I filled the tank at a gas stop, Mason wandered into the convenience store. Through the bright windows, I caught sight of him on the phone, shoulders hunched, voice urgent and low. When he returned, I asked casually, "Everything all right? Saw you on the phone." "Just checking the weather for tomorrow," he said too quickly. "Storm systems moving in. Should clear by morning." It was a lie. I knew it instantly. The forecast I'd checked was clear skies for 3 days straight. As we pulled back onto the highway, unease settled into me like an old familiar weight. The same instinct that had once kept me alive in hostile territory, now whispered that danger was near. I glanced at Mason gripping the passenger door, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the dark road ahead. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what. Not yet. 40 miles later, Denali's entrance appeared around a bend, its wooden signs looming out of the dusk. Cabins huddled beneath towering spruce trees, their windows glowing faintly against the gathering dark. The visitor center hummed with an energy that felt out of place for March. Most tourists came in summer. Those here in late winter were either locals or serious outdoorsmen. Denali Lodge Motel matched the brochure photos. Mason had shown me rustic log construction, rooms named after wildlife, Grizzly Den, Caribou Creek. The young desk clerk, hands rough from outdoor work, processed our registration. Mason hovered by the wall display of trail maps. "First time to Denali?" she asked. "For him," I said, nodding toward Mason. "I've been up here before. Military exercises." "Which trails are you considering?" Mason stepped in before I could answer. "Tillanica River backcountry. We want the full wilderness experience." The clerk's expression shifted, concern, not judgment. "That's advanced terrain, remote. Most people start with the shorter trails. We're experienced campers." Mason replied, his voice too quick. His idea of experience included no camping in the last decade. That concern deepened when we met Ranger Jennifer Walsh. She looked carved out of the Alaskan landscape itself, confident, no nonsense, her presence filling the ranger briefing room. The air smelled of coffee and pine, the walls bore maps scarred with red markers. "Gentlemen, let's be clear," she said, spreading a topographical map across the table. "The Tillanica River route takes you 30 miles from the nearest ranger station. No cell coverage, no other campers this time of year." Her finger tapped danger zones. "Recent grizzly activity here, here and here. 2 cubs spotted last week, so their mother is close. Wolves in this region too, and moose in spring. They're unpredictable and territorial. Mason leaned forward, studying the map with unnerving intensity. What about emergency evacuation? Helicopter rescue, weather permitting. She replied flatly. Could be days if conditions turn bad. Her eyes narrowed. I have to ask, what's your combined wilderness experience? I answered with honesty about my military background. Mason mumbled something vague about camping with friends. Ranger Walsh's doubt was clear. Yes, sir, with respect, this route isn't appropriate for beginners. We've got excellent guided tours, safer trails. We'll be fine. Mason cut in sharply. My father's practically a survival expert. Her look said, I've seen this before. She made us sign liability waivers, showed us safety videos on bear encounters. I insisted on renting a Remington 870. Alaska rule number 1, never enter bear country unarmed. Mason eyed it nervously. You sure about that? Never been surer, I said, the weight familiar in my hands. Our last stop was emergency prep. Walsh demonstrated the GPS beacon, her tone crisp and professional. Hold this button 5 seconds, we'll get your exact coordinates. But even then, rescue could take 12 to 18 hours minimum. As we loaded our packs, I felt that old pre-mission tension tighten in my chest. Every detail screamed warning. Mason's inexperience, his obsession with total isolation, his eagerness that felt more like determination than excitement. Still sure about this route? I asked. As we pulled away, Mason's smile looked painted on. Absolutely. No turning back now, right, Dad? The words landed wrong, less encouragement. More finality. Through the rearview mirror, I watched the ranger station shrink into the distance. Civilization fading into forest. My gut told me we weren't heading into adventure. We were heading into something else. The road narrowed, branches scraping against the truck like skeletal fingers. My phone signal flickered, then vanished. We're officially off the grid. I muttered. Mason chuckled, but it rang hollow. Perfect, just us and nature. By mile 23, the drivable road ended. Weathered wooden posts, like grave markers, stood at the trailhead. We unloaded our packs, mine was balanced. Years of habit. Mason's bulged awkwardly, the straps biting into his shoulders. Jesus, this thing weighs a ton.
He groaned.
Proper packing takes practice. I adjusted his load, noting how he winced when I touched his right shoulder. You hurt yourself. Old injury. Nothing serious. The trail wound deep through spruce forest, sunlight choked by the canopy. Moss-covered logs forced detours. Streams shimmered under thin ice, demanding careful footing. Signs of wildlife were immediate. Moose tracks the size of dinner plates, eagle cries overhead, the distant call of wolves. Hear that? Mason froze, pale. 5 miles out, maybe more, I said, steady. His nerves weren't from wolves. His fear came from something else. 3 hours later, we reached a clearing by a Russian creek, flat ground, fresh water, wide sight lines. Perfect campsite. My instincts assessed defensive positions, escape routes, supply access. Mason collapsed onto a log. Winded. How much farther? This'll do for tonight. We push deeper tomorrow. As I built camp with muscle memory, Mason fumbled with a tent, holding tangled guidelines like surrender flags. Dodd, can you? I helped, teaching him technique. For a moment it felt like old times, before suspicion, before secrets. But the question still burned. Why drag us into the wild, if you couldn't even pitch a tent? That night, the fire cracked and shadows danced across the clearing. I cooked while Mason stared into the flames, silent, unreadable. The temperature dropped fast. Alaska nights in March didn't forgive. Remember when we used to do this? I tried, searching for connection. You were 10. Wouldn't stop roasting marshmallows until they burned black. Your mom loved those trips, said camping brought out the best in people. Mason nodded, but his eyes stayed distant. Tell me about your childhood, Dad, he said suddenly. Before the military. Before the business. What was it like being poor? The question caught me off guard. Mason had never asked before. I shared fragments, Montana fields, summer farm work, earning every cent by sweat. Sounds hard, he said. But there was no sympathy in his tone, only calculation. Hard work built character, I replied. Taught me the value of earning what you have. Mason's gaze flickered in the firelight. something unspoken tightening in his expression. And in that moment, I realized he wasn't here to learn from me. He was measuring me. Something shifted in Mason's face that night, just a flicker, maybe resentment, maybe deep-seated frustration, but his voice stayed eerily calm when he finally spoke. Lucky for me, huh? Skipping all that so-called character building. He forced a smile, but it never reached his eyes. Around the fire the conversation dragged on, Mason pressing me for stories about my years in the military. The deployments, the survival training, the instincts that had kept me alive in places where no man should have lasted. Encouraged by what I thought was genuine curiosity, I opened up more than usual, speaking of body language, of knowing when someone was lying. You look for patterns, I explained, nudging the fire until sparks curled up into the sky. The voice, the eyes, the story they tell, inconsistencies give them away. Mason leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Why do you care so much about lies? He asked softly. I shrugged it off, telling him I had always been good at reading people, but the way he stared at me, motionless, unsettled me. Later, when I crawled into my tent, Mason had volunteered to keep first watch. Odd, I thought. He'd never cared for solitude, never shown interest in the stillness of nature, but I was exhausted, lulled by the fire's fading glow and the forest's silence. The last thing I heard before sleep claimed me wasn't the casual shuffle of someone tending flames, it was stillness. Careful, deliberate, waiting stillness. At dawn, a metallic clatter jolted me awake. Unzipping the flap, the cold air bit at my lungs, and there was Mason standing by the truck, methodically packing our gear with a precision he'd never once displayed in his life. Food, maps, rifles, even the emergency beacon, all disappearing neatly into the vehicle. What's going on? My voice sliced through the morning frost. Mason stiffened, then straightened, his posture tight, defiant. Getting ready to leave, he said flatly. Leave? We planned 3 more days. What's the rush? He didn't look at me. Weather's turning bad. The words were clipped, practiced, a lie that floated heavy between us. The sky above was crystal clear. My instincts, long dormant, stirred violently. Mason, what's really happening here? That's when it snapped. The dam of years, maybe decades, broke in his eyes. Resentment poured out, raw and venomous. You want to know what's happening? I'm done. Done with your control. Done with your judgment. Done living like your employee instead of your son. I stepped closer, searching his face. Son, don't call me that, he shouted, fists tightening at his sides. Sons don't have to beg for scraps while their father sits on millions. Sons don't grow up in the shadow of a man who thinks survival is a lesson instead of love. His words struck harder than any physical blow I had ever taken. This wasn't anger born overnight. This was years of festering hate, sharpened into a weapon. I froze as his chest heaved, realizing the chilling truth. This trip had never been about bonding, never about wilderness. Mason hadn't brought me out here to reconnect. He had brought me here to break me. You've given me nothing. Mason's voice cracked, but it wasn't the cry of a frustrated son. It was the fury of a man convinced he'd been wronged for years. His words cut sharper than any blade. You made me dependent. You kept me weak. You controlled every breath I took with your damn checkbook. But not anymore, Dad. I'm taking control now. The blood drained from my face as his words sank in. My hands trembled, not from the cold Alaskan air, but from the realization that every step of this camping trip had been a trap, carefully laid by my own child. My own flesh and blood had lured me into the wilderness, smiling all the while, only to reveal teeth at the end. So that's it, I muttered, my chest tightening as though iron bands had been cinched around my ribs. This trip, this was planned from the start. Mason's laugh rang out, hollow and cruel, finally catching on. Old man. Military genius takes a while, huh? Why? My voice cracked, desperation bleeding into every syllable. If it's money you need, if you wanted help, we could have figured something out. We always do. I don't want scraps from your table anymore. Mason snapped. His eyes were cold, steel hard, unrecognizable from the boy I'd raised. I don't want your allowance. I want what's mine, my right. Your business, your assets. Everything you've dangled in front of me, like a leash around my neck. The morning air turned colder, sharper, biting through my jacket, as if nature itself recoiled from the scene. I searched his face for some shred of the boy I once tucked in at night, the boy who cried after scraping his knee, the boy who used to call me his hero. But what looked back at me was not a son, it was a stranger. You're planning to leave me here. My words tasted like ash. Mason's lips curled into a smirk. Very good. Finally thinking. Yeah, I'm leaving you right here. 30 miles from the nearest soul. Maybe the wilderness will finally teach you what dependence feels like. Panic churned in my chest. Mason, this is bear country. Without equipment, without GPS, I won't last the night. He slammed the tailgate shut with finality. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Should have thought about that before you turned me into your puppet. Maybe you'll survive. Maybe you won't. Either way, I inherit what should have been mine a long time ago. Please, the words scraped out of my throat. Raw. Humiliating. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix it. Don't do this. Not like this. For a flicker of a second, something shifted in his eyes. Hesitation. Maybe a memory. A trace of the sun I thought I knew. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by an icy resolve that froze my blood. Goodbye, Dad. He climbed into the truck. His movements calm, deliberate, merciless. The engine coughed, then roared alive. Before pulling away, he leaned out the window one last time. Try not to meet the grizzlies too quickly. I want you to have time to think about what you made me into. No, Mason. I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, but the truck lurched backward, throwing gravel into the air. His face, his cold, unflinching face, was the last thing I saw through the windshield before the vehicle curved around a bend, swallowed by endless trees. Silence fell. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but suffocating. No human sounds, no engines. Only the whistle of wind through spruce, and the distant, chilling cry of a hawk. I stood frozen on the dirt road, dust curling around my boots, as reality anchored itself with brutal force. My son had just left me to die. The betrayal cut deeper than hunger or fear ever could. The boy I'd carried on my shoulders, the boy I sacrificed for, protected with every breath of my being, had turned executioner. Not with a bullet, but with abandonment. With cold calculation, shock pressed down, threatening to unravel me. But years of Navy training stirred inside my bones, dragging me back from the brink. Panic was a luxury. Despair, a death sentence. Out here, 30 miles from civilization, surrounded by grizzlies and wilderness, survival would demand every ounce of discipline I had left. I closed my eyes, forcing my breath to steady. The first rule of survival echoed in my head like a command: assess your resources. And as I stood alone in the Alaskan wilderness, abandoned by the only person I thought I could trust, one truth carved itself into me like stone. If I survived this, Mason would never see the same father again. I patted myself down with shaking hands. Pockets turned up little more than a wallet, a ring of house keys, and a small folding knife I'd forgotten I even carried. No food, no water, no GPS, no beacon, just the clothes on my back and the gnawing knowledge that my son had stripped me bare. Rule 1. Assess resources. Already failing. Rule 2. Evaluate the environment. Alaska in March was merciless. By nightfall temperatures would plunge below freezing. The forest pressed in on me, dense spruce, unmarked trails, silence broken only by the occasional rustle in the underbrush. Ranger Walsh's briefing replayed in my mind like a warning I hadn't taken seriously enough. Fresh grizzly sightings, wolf packs moving through, sudden weather shifts. Rule 3. Prioritize survival, shelter, water, signaling, navigation. I studied the sun, its low arc already hinting at shortened daylight. East meant plunging deeper into wilderness. West meant, eventually, the main road, though I had no real sense of how far. My memory dredged up half-formed maps from the ranger station, rivers flowing northwest, toward the park boundary. Standing still meant death, so I moved. I followed the faint tire tracks Mason's truck had left, my boots crunching on frost-hardened soil. 100 yards later, the tracks diverged from what looked like an animal trail cutting through the brush. Game trails meant water, water meant life. I veered onto it, my knees screamed with every uneven step. At 58, I was far from the soldier I once was, and every ache reminded me of it. But anger kept my legs moving. Anger at Mason, anger at myself for being blind. Anger at the years wasted enabling my son to become the man who had just written my death sentence. The spruce closed in, their branches knitting overhead into a living tunnel. Sunlight dimmed to a gloomy twilight, even though it was still midday. I snapped branches as I walked, leaving a crude trail for rescue that might never come. Then I saw it, signs of bears, claw marks raked across bark, massive prints pressed deep into the mud, fresh scat steaming in the cold air. I forced myself to make noise, clapping, humming, muttering aloud, remembering Walsh's warning, never surprise a bear. The irony twisted like a knife. Mason had left me where predators might be the least of my worries. Hours passed, my throat grew dry, then parched. My legs shook with fatigue, but stopping would mean losing precious daylight. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Engines. Mechanical. Rhythmic. Human. I froze, head cocked. Multiple vehicles. North, maybe half a mile. ATVs. Motorcycles, rescue, hunters, whoever it was. They were my only chance. Hope surged in my chest, pumping adrenaline through my weary frame. I veered north, pushing through snarled undergrowth that clawed at my clothing and tore lines across my face. The growl of engines grew louder. Deliberate. Methodical. The forest thinned. I broke through the tree line into a clearing, stumbling, gasping, half delirious from dehydration. 4 ATV riders sat dismounted, helmets off, eating lunch. They stared at me as though a ghost had crawled out of the woods. The leader, mid-40s, bearded, sun-scorched, eyes sharp with experience, killed his engine and strode toward me. His voice carried command but also concern. "Sir, what happened? Why are you out here alone?" "My son." My voice cracked, raw. "He left me. Took the truck. All the gear. He meant for me to die out here." Their faces shifted from confusion to horror. "That's attempted murder," the bearded man said flatly. He pulled off his helmet. "Name's Oliver Reed, used to be a park ranger here. These are my friends." Another rider, a woman in her 30s, pressed a water bottle into my hands. I drank like a starving man, every swallow searing down my parched throat. "I'm William Harper," I managed, still shaking. "My son Mason brought me out here for a camping trip. Then, he took everything. Drove off." Oliver studied me with practiced eyes, measuring my words, my condition, my truth. Finally, he nodded. "When did this happen?" "This morning. 4, maybe 5 hours ago." Oliver's jaw tightened. He looked to his GPS, then back at me. "If your son took the main road, it's a 6-hour drive minimum to Anchorage." His eyes flicked back to me, narrowing. "But I know a shortcut. An old ranger trail through the backcountry. With ATVs, we can have you at the park entrance in 90 minutes. The implication hit me like a live wire. My pulse hammered. "You mean," my voice shook, "I could get back before him?" Oliver's eyes locked on mine, steady and sure, easily. The question came from Oliver like a test. "Do you want law enforcement involved immediately, or do you have other plans?" Something in me hardened. The desperation and fear that had clung to me since dawn evaporated, replaced by clarity sharper than steel. Mason had calculated my death, expected my weakness, bet on my helplessness. But he'd underestimated 2 things, the solidarity of men like Oliver Reed, and the survival instincts he'd inherited, but never learned to master. "I want to get back to the motel first," I said carefully. "Before I decide anything about police." Oliver's expression barely shifted, but I saw the understanding in his eyes. He motioned to his ATV. "Climb on, we'll take the ranger trail. Your son will never see us coming." The ride was brutal and swift. Hidden service trails cut through the wilderness, like arteries of survival, known only to rangers and seasoned guides. Creek crossings splashed icy water across our boots, inclines threatened to flip us backward, and twice we dismounted to wrestle the machines around fallen timber. Oliver navigated without hesitation. "I spent 15 years out here," he called over the engine roar. "Seen every mistake you can imagine. But what your son did, that's not a mistake. That's a crime." We emerged onto paved road faster than I believed possible. Denali Lodge Motel rose in the distance, its log cabin architecture radiating warmth after my brush with death. I scanned the parking lot. The rental truck wasn't there. "Not back yet," Oliver observed, cool and professional. "You've got time. Whatever reception you're planning." His companions handed me their numbers, offering witness statements if the law became involved. Oliver pressed a card into my palm, personal cell, email scrawled in ink. "Call me when you're ready to make this official," he said. "Your son needs consequences." As his group mounted their ATVs, Oliver lingered a moment longer. "Sir," he asked, "mind me asking, what exactly are you planning to do when he gets back?" I looked at the motel door, at the documents in my jacket pocket, at the years of careful avoidance, guilt, and weakness that had led to this moment. Mason had planned my destruction with patience and calculation. Now it was my turn. "I'm going to give him exactly what he wants," I said quietly. "Just not in the way he expects." Back in the motel room, I laid everything out with a soldier's precision. Oliver's card on the nightstand, my phone open, 911 keyed to speed dial. On the desk, spread in deliberate order, were the legal documents I had prepared in Seattle weeks ago. At the time, they'd been an act of wounded disappointment. Now they were a loaded weapon. Mason would inherit nothing. Every dollar, every share of the business, every asset I had built over decades would go to veterans programs, wildlife conservation, and the Sarah Harper Memorial Scholarship. His attempt to kill me for wealth would yield him less than nothing, just a criminal record and a legacy of betrayal. But words on paper weren't enough. I needed his voice, his intent, his admission. I dialed Oliver. He picked up instantly. William settled in. "All right," I said, "I need your help with something specific. When Mason returns, I want it all documented. His words, his reaction, everything." "You're planning to confront him before we call police?" "I'm planning to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, the chance to inherit, right up until the moment he realizes what he's actually done to himself." There was a pause. Then Oliver's steady voice. "That's strategic. You want me there as a witness? If you're willing. And bring that camera I saw earlier. Mason's going to hang himself with his own words, but we need it preserved for a jury." "What time?" I calculated. Main Park Road, stops for gas. His cautious way of driving unfamiliar terrain, between 9 and 10 tonight. He'll expect to find an empty room, a grieving father who never made it back. Instead he finds me very much alive, and waiting. Oliver agreed to arrive by 8:30. Next I called my attorney in Seattle. The conversation was brief but decisive. Tomorrow the will would be filed officially. By the time Mason opened his mouth tonight, his inheritance would already be ashes. Finally, I arranged with the motel clerk, an old woman who'd clearly seen enough Alaskan drama to know better than to ask questions, for Oliver to take an adjoining room. His camera would have an unobstructed view. Evening descended with deceptive calm. I showered, changed into clean clothes, and prepared the stage like a general readying a battlefield. The papers sat waiting on the desk. My phone within reach. The adjoining door unlocked for Oliver's entry. Every detail arranged. Every contingency considered. Tonight Mason would learn what it felt like to underestimate me. The question hung in the air. Do you want law enforcement immediately, or do you have other plans? Something hard crystallized in my chest, replacing the desperation and fear I'd carried since dawn. Mason had calculated my death, planned my abandonment, counted on my helplessness. He'd made one critical error, underestimating the solidarity of the wilderness community, and my own survival instincts. "I want to get back to the motel first," I said carefully. "Before I decide anything about police." Oliver nodded, no judgment in his eyes. "Climb on behind me. We'll take the ranger trail. Your son will never see us coming." The ATV roared to life, tearing through hidden service paths I hadn't known existed, a secret web cut through Denali for emergencies, known only to rangers and seasoned guides, creek crossings, sudden inclines, fallen trees that forced us to dismount and drag the machines forward. Oliver navigated with the ease of a man who'd traveled this terrain for decades. 15 years as a ranger out here, he called over the engine. Seen plenty of bad calls, but abandonment like that, that's not a mistake. That's criminal. We made excellent time. The forest gave way to pavement, and soon the lodge's log cabin silhouette rose in the distance, more welcoming than anything I'd ever seen. The parking lot was empty of our rental truck. "Not back yet," Oliver observed. "You've got time to prepare whatever reception you're planning." His companions passed me their numbers, offering statements if the law became involved. Oliver handed me his card, personal cell, email in neat block letters. "Call when you're ready to make this official. Your son needs consequences." As the others mounted their ATVs, Oliver lingered. "Sir, mind me asking, what exactly are you planning to do when he gets back?" I glanced at the motel door, at the papers folded in my jacket pocket. Mason had spent years plotting my destruction. Now it was my turn. I'm going to give him exactly what he wants, I said. Just not in the way he expects. Back inside the motel room, I laid everything out like equipment before a mission. Oliver's card on the nightstand. My phone with 911 pre-dialed. On the desk spread deliberately where Mason would see them, the legal documents I had prepared in Seattle. 3 weeks ago, I'd rewritten my will in a moment of paternal disappointment. Now it felt like divine preparation. Mason would inherit nothing. Every cent, every share of the business, would go to veterans' charities, conservation trusts, and the Sarah Harper Memorial Scholarship. His attempt to kill me for wealth would leave him with nothing but his own confession. But paper wasn't enough. I needed evidence. Witnesses. A record that would follow him for the rest of his life. I dialed Oliver. He answered on the first ring. William. Settled in. All right. I need your help with something specific. When Mason returns, I want everything documented. His reaction, his words, all of it. You planning to confront him before calling police? I'm planning to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, the chance to inherit. Right up until he realizes what he's actually done to himself. A pause. Then Oliver. That's strategic. You want me there as a witness, if you're willing. And bring that camera you had earlier. Mason's going to say things that need preserving for a jury. What time you expecting him? I calculated. Main Park Road to Anchorage Highway, a stop for gas. A cautious driver on unfamiliar roads. Between 9 and 10 tonight, he'll be tired, overconfident, expecting to find an empty room and a grieving father. Instead he'll find me waiting. Oliver agreed to arrive by 8:30. Next I called my attorney in Seattle. The conversation was short but final. Tomorrow morning, the new will would be filed, no matter what. Mason's inheritance would vanish the moment the documents hit the courthouse. Lastly, I arranged an adjoining room for Oliver. The desk clerk, an elderly woman who had seen more Alaskan drama than most, asked no questions. Evening settled over Denali with eerie calm. I showered off the wilderness grime, changed into clean clothes, and prepared the battlefield. The papers spread across the desk. Oliver's camera would have a clear sightline. Every contingency in place. Mason thought he'd written the ending to my story. Tonight I would show him it was only the beginning of his. Mason's voice cracked with rage, but his words were like knives. You've given me nothing, Dad. You made me dependent, kept me weak, controlled every breath of my life with your checkbook. Well, guess what? I'm done being your puppet. I'm taking control now. The truth hit me like a bullet. The camping trip. Every detail, every choice. He had planned this. Mason, my throat tightened. If you needed money, we could have worked something out. He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. I don't want your allowance anymore. I want what's mine. The business. The assets. Everything you've dangled over my head for decades. The air turned colder, sharper. I stared at this stranger wearing my son's face. You're planning to leave me here. He smirked. Very good. Yes. 30 miles of wilderness should finally teach you what real dependence feels like. Mason, this is bear country. No GPS, no gear. You're sentencing me to death. Should have thought about that before you made me into your puppet. He slammed the tailgate shut. Maybe you'll survive, maybe not. Either way, I inherit what should have been mine years ago. Please. The word ripped raw from my throat. Whatever I did wrong, we can fix this. Don't do this. For a heartbeat, something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, maybe, or some forgotten piece of affection. But then it vanished, replaced by stone. Goodbye, Dad. Try not to meet the grizzlies too quickly. I want you to have time to think about what you created. The engine roared. I staggered forward, desperate, but the truck reversed, dust kicking up. Through the windshield, I saw his face cold, calculated, devoid of anything human. Mason. My shout echoed against the Alaskan mountains as the truck disappeared. Silence. Just wind in the spruce trees and the cry of a hawk. For a long moment, I stood motionless. My son, the boy I'd raised, fed, loved, had just sentenced me to die. But shock was a luxury I couldn't afford. Decades of Navy discipline took hold. Survive first. Feel later. Weeks later, when rescuers pulled me from the wild, the truth surfaced. Mason had forged my will, drained accounts, tried to seize the business. His arrogance betrayed him. When I saw him in court, shackled, he tried one last smirk, but the mask cracked. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. He sent me letters from jail, pleas, apologies, manipulations. I fed each one into the shredder without opening. For the first time in decades, my house was silent. Not with grief, but with clarity. I had lost a son, yes. But I had also shed the chains of control, lies, and illusions. Mason wanted me broken. Instead he had given me back myself.